Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. We have quite a bit of news to cover today. Once again, one of those weeks where every news story outdoes the last, and everything seems more important than the last. So it's one of those cycles that perpetually builds itself up again. We have quite a bit to cover, from Ukraine to the Middle East to some news about Europe and the economic situation over there, and even a touch of U.S. domestic news. And really, we are approaching about 2 months until 2023. So we're going to do what we always try to do at the end of the year, the last few months of the year, and really just try to give you a window into what the upcoming year will look like in preparation for our year in review show, which is going to be here very soon, in about 9.5, 10 weeks, if you actually look at how much is left in the year. So that is going to be probably the biggest show we've ever done at this rate, because I mean, it just seems like every year it gets more and more intense. Now, our 20th anniversary of 9/11 episode is pretty big. Don't get me wrong; that's probably the biggest in terms of like depth of research we've done so far. But 2022 year in review is going to be a very arduous process that I am very much so looking forward to. And I will remind you once again, before we get too far into it, that we do have alternate platforms right now because of, let's just say, the instability of our gracious hosts on YouTube. I haven't gotten any of the additional content uploaded yet. I'm still looking on a way to turn my video files into MP3 files for the Substack if anyone has any suggestions. I think I may have figured out a method, but the BitChute page, I will certainly have that uploaded. And just because the way the uploads and the premieres work, if you want to watch it first, it'll be up on BitChute first, as well as the Substack once I get that worked out, and then will be the YouTube premiere. So if you want to watch it beforehand, it'll be there the night before. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So, the Kherson offensive, it seems that it has begun in a very small fashion, as you were explaining to me off the show, and that while this is too large to be a probing force, it's also too small to be the actual force pushing into it. And there's been all kinds of news out of Kherson and a lot of speculation surrounding it. So without further ado, once again, I will let you get into it.
Yeah, so my thank you. My suspicion is the apparent pressure on the Ukrainian military by the Americans to push for a success before the midterms. Because the midterms right now, the speculation is that they're not looking very good for for the Biden team, and I've seen other articles suggesting that if the Republicans win, then the amount of money that is going to go to Ukraine is going to be less. This is why there is a bipartisan vote to allocate roughly $53 billion for all of 2023. I look at that as potentially the Biden team understanding that they're going to lose seats in the House and that they had better get this money fixed right now because it may not be there next year. So my suspicion is that the probing attacks that Ukraine is doing right now, which are with significant numbers, sometimes 2 or 3 battalions. So we're looking roughly between like 450 to 700 personnel in armor racing to these positions. And that's now in one area that I'm talking about, which is like the furthest east of the Kherson front, south of Kryvyi Rog, near the Dnieper River. But there have been attacks that are coming from the central part directly north of Kherson city and slightly west of it, uh, from a position south of Nikolaev. So my feeling is that what is happening right now is what they want: a large probing attack to find out how well the defenses of the Russians are, but it's big enough that they can actually secure something to rush in further armaments into those positions. Uh, the chatter, on Telegram is that enormous forces are being gathered in Kherson, something like 70,000, which would be very substantial. But it's been 3 days of this, and so far they have not been successful. The losses have been high. Sometimes the losses sound quite incredible from the Russian side, but I will say there had to have been losses because there's no new ground that's been gained. And if it had, then they would have deployed more troops into that area. And because these probing attacks are about a third to 50% larger than they would have been, they really want just about any territory that they can get. So I think it's the pressure from the U.S. That is forcing them to uh, bet for more. Now is convinced around the strikes by the drones and the missiles on the part of the Russians is just them, being unable to cope with defeat and so on and so on. Of course, we know that's not the case. Uh, Bridges in Kherson are still being targeted. 11 people were killed today in the Kherson region, I believe somewhere around Novakhovka. There was an attempt again to take uh, um, the energy plant Novakhovka and Derikogar. I forgot how to pronounce it. That failed. It was a nighttime attack. I don't know what the exact numbers are. 37 boats. I think 11 of them were sunk. It's hard to tell, right? Like there are no videos. We don't know the scale of these attacks. I would say that for the Ukrainians, gaining control of either the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant or the Endergar power plant, which is not nuclear, would be really, really significant for them. They have wanted this badly. So I don't doubt an attack happened. I just don't know what the size of it was. Um, Fighting in Donbass, okay, so I'll just say Zaporozhye, really there has been no changes from last week, just more artillery duels, but the borders are exactly as they really have been for months now. Um, there have been small changes in Donbass and Marinka and Avdiivka. Very, very small gradual gains by the Russians. In Bakhmut, there was a counteroffensive by the Ukrainians in order to retake. Thousands of troops actually have been moved in there, and maybe this is why Kherson right now is being delayed. In any case, Wagner is mostly fighting there, and I think there are Chechens along with the militias from Donbass. Uh, so the Ukrainians were repelled there, and they've consolidated some of their gains in the factories that they took over last week. So it's still a very slow-going process. An interesting development, though, that's been going on for the last 2 weeks is in the area where the Russians lost a ton of land on the Kharkov front. And I believe that the last week I spoke about how there were gains in Kremenaya. It was a town that the Russians, I think, held or partly lost. They have it under their control now. And I believe that one of the roads starts with a G. That has been retaken. Let me see. I just want to, for the readers, for the listeners, I just want to, I may not be able to find it. In any case, There are small, steady gains that are developing now, also in the Kharkov region. So they have not been able to push further north and further east. That would completely begin to surround uh, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The Russians are actually right now only about 20 kilometers away from Liman. So they've made some gains back. And I think even some Ukrainian sources have acknowledged this. The other big news, of course, we spoke about how railroads, energy plants, all kinds of things are uh, transformers are being destroyed now for 9 straight days by the Russians, and it has plunged Ukraine into darkness. This is a very serious thing. Kiev now, several cities now have rolling blackouts. Definitely at night. Yesterday, I noticed that Kiev had almost no lights on whatsoever. Um, and enormous forces are now gathering north of Ukraine, both in Belarus and areas just north of Kharkov. The other big news is the Russians have mandated martial law into the new territories that they've gained. Uh, Civilians are being moved out, and it will take probably 2 weeks to remove most of the population. And this was a very bad headline. Although, honestly, Russian telegram channels took it very well. They were very happy to see this. Um, Based on selection of emojis and the comments that were made. And then yesterday, I watched a very interesting video by Dima of military analysis. And his speculation is this: it is not just a preparation for a very big offensive by the Ukrainians to take Kherson. It is also to house basically Russian forces in the city. This is why they want civilians moved out, because Kherson, the city, is really, it's about 300,000, maybe 320,000 before the war broke out. There's a lot less people there now. In any case, there are no other large settlements, or there aren't really large villages. And the speculation is about 7,200,000 reserves are going to go into this area. And what he thinks is this is overkill for a defense. Uh, So he's looking at Kherson as a jumping board to go after Nikolaev. Time will only tell whether this is the case with Ukraine. Now, the president of Switzerland visited Kiev today, but Scholz canceled his trip to go to Kiev. Could be several reasons why.
Well, that's on top of the mass evacuations of everyone from Chinese nationals to Iranian
Yes, you're
nationals to
right. I'm glad
Israelis,
you brought that up.
and just the clearing out of embassies where, and it started first among countries that were friendly to Russia, such as Iran, China, I believe even Belarus, and then it followed through with Israel after the showdown when it came to Israel threatening to send Ukraine arms. But this is, again, it follows a lot of the diplomatic staff from various nations and nationals from various nations being ordered out of the country.
Hmm. Yes, and that includes countries that have embassies in Ukraine, that in Kiev, that are part of CSI or CIS. Sorry, CIS. Now, uh, Putin was at this CIS meeting, and he said a few things that were kind of unusual. You know, for instance, he said, we were very close to signing a peace deal with Zelensky until it fell through, and we, as a goodwill gesture, moved out of the Kiev region. And after that, we lost bargaining leverage, right? Okay, that's his story. Take it or leave it. But then he was asked by a reporter if um, what will be, what was the whole point of going in, and he said, we had no intention of taking new territories. We wanted a political agreement, blah blah blah. This line has been given before. Um, but then he said something like, going forward, I'm trying to remember how he said it. He strongly implied that Ukraine would be greatly changed, that those territories are ours now, and negotiations are not possible. Uh, he left it open ended, but you got the feeling that he was hinting at, um, you know, reinvading parts of Ukraine. Because if he wants to really change it, that is something that will have to happen, right? And he's not giving these territories back. Most of these territories have still some percentage points of territory that still has to be regained, or yes, gained or regained, depending on which territory you're talking about. So that was a very interesting thing. And then you had the news of two apparent, I think they were from Tajikistan, uh, volunteers who had gone to the Kursk region, that's just north of Ukraine, at a training camp, and they gunned down over 30 Russian recruits. 11 of them were killed before they were themselves killed. So I thought that was very interesting that those two things happened on the same day.
Yeah, it is when it comes to that. And I just did have a couple of things about Ukraine myself. Of course, the massive infrastructure strikes had continued and are continuing, and they're expected to be more so. While I wouldn't go as far as to call this a sustained campaign yet, it is far closer to that than a single strike that we saw after the Kerch Bridge incident. So that is also another speculated reason why you're seeing such an effort for a Ukrainian push right now, because the infrastructure keeps getting hit. I can't remember whether we reported this on last show, but as you recall, that it is highly speculated Zelensky is no longer in Kiev, especially after the strikes, and some people speculate that once again he is in Poland. However, I take great caution to those kind of reports because
Mm-hmm.
I remember within the first 3 weeks of the war, it was Zelensky is in Lvov, Zelensky has fled to Poland, Zelensky is X, Y, or Z, when he very clearly was still in Kiev, and even during the feint or the siege, as some people may call it, he was still there. But after the substantial strikes, that has seemed to have driven him out of the city, and that the Ukrainian government, although they haven't disclosed the location, does seem to have temporarily relocated. If I had to guess, it would be somewhere on the fringes of the west. Lvov would be the obvious expectation, but
Mm-hmm.
that's probably the reason it isn't. So I would just imagine somewhere on the western fringes, somewhere in Galicia, that you have the temporary Ukrainian government set up. And I was also going through the Twitter and Telegram sphere myself, and somebody did actually raise an interesting point when it came to the fate of Ukraine and how this war has been conducted. That Ukraine has, the way they've conducted this war, and this is no doubt at the behest of their financiers and their handlers, mainly in Washington, but also Brussels, London, etc., that they've taken the strategy of digging in, making it so painful for the Russians to continue forward that they eventually abandon the campaign and don't even engage in negotiations. And this is also bolstered by the fact that anytime anyone tries to negotiate with Russia, they end up either in a cell or executed. And it has left the Ukrainians in a position where they have given the Russians a very a choice with two extremes. They can either abandon the entire campaign, which is of course what
Yes.
they want, or Russia could double or even triple down and completely crush the Ukrainian state. And I mean, we were talking.
This is what I mean about Putin's speech. He
Yes,
was hinting at something like this, that they were given that they have been given no choice, and now um, we hadn't any expectations to take territory, uh, which implies, but now we do, and they would have to. It's kind of like the only way this stops, and I've said it on the show before, is if part of the Ukrainian army like just switches sides. There's just no way. I think the major command centers are not even in Ukraine anymore.
oh,
I
absolutely
think
not.
they have lower level officers who are receiving commands from Germany, from Ramstein, or wherever. It's probably not just one area, but that would be my first guess.
I mean, considering the
And,
fact that for several months you've had Ukrainian soldiers trained abroad, you've had them treated for injuries abroad, you've had them
yeah,
supplied abroad. This is no longer just. I mean, I know everyone has said this. Everyone from the U.S. to Russia to the EU has said this isn't just a Ukrainian war because in reality, it is not just a
yeah.
Russo-Ukrainian wars. It is not just those two sides. And it's actually funny if you want a piece of Wikipedia bias, if you go on there, and I'm sure you've seen other war Wikipedias where it lists the two sides, and then it has the supported by section under it. Well, under that, it has Belarus as supporting Russia and the two Donbass republics, but Ukraine, with it, it has no support listed under it. After the several billions of dollars, after the weapons shipped in, after the massive financial sanctions, which didn't seem to really do their intended purpose on Russia, and after everything that has been put into Ukraine by the West, they don't even get the recognition of being supporters of Ukraine, despite the
Yeah.
fact that they have not been able to shut up about it since before the war, actually. And I mean, some of them since even before 2014. So, as you were saying, and as you were referencing the Putin speech, yes, at this point there will have to be annexations. There will have to be much more drastic measures than what originally would have been expected. And you could say part of that is because this crisis has been kicked down the road for so long. And I also wanted to address what you had brought up about a large portion of the Ukrainian forces switching sides. I do believe, and this was a speculation of mine at first, and it was a speculation of many other people, and arguably even a speculation of Russia, that if they came in with the heavy strikes that they did at the opening phases of this war, that the more Russian sympathetic elements within the Ukrainian military would do what the Iraqi army did in 2003 and pack up and go home or just refuse to fight. And while that may have been true, say if they invaded several years earlier, you have to keep in mind since 2014 there has been a countrywide level campaign across the entirety of Ukraine, from social to civic to military to political life, to just absolutely erase any pro-Russian sympathies or any even suspected pro-Russian sympathies
Yeah, they've that's all
within the
been
country.
cleansed.
Oh,
The, eh,
it's been a
yeah,
it's I know hypocrisy counts for nothing when it comes to arguments or when it comes to actual power, but had this happened, say 100 years ago in Germany, or 80 years ago in Germany, we'd again, we actually have a term for it. We call it Kristallnacht, and I know those are very trite comparisons, comparing things to the Second World War and the German regime at the time. But I can't really think of a better contemporary example. Now, of
mhm.
course, there's several examples. Like the opposition has always been cleansed from society. There has always been ethnic tensions and ethnic crackdowns. But just in terms of a contemporary example, I really can't think of anything more so than that. But so that was a large speculation that didn't come to fruition, which frankly I should have been able to see, and many other people who are right about a lot of things and have actually given good takes on this war at the beginning should have been able to see. I think it was a sense of optimism among people who maybe pro-Russia is the term for it, maybe just anti-American empire is the term for it, that this would be a quick and easy operation, And again, you could also get that's getting really far into a speculation of why Russia attacked when they did, why they employed the strategy that they did, that we've talked about at length, and I'm going to spare you rehashing and
Yeah, yeah.
rediscussion of that right now. But at this point, and we were also discussing this off show, as abstract as it sounds, the only way I can see a lasting Russian victory right now, and I know I was just talking about how the government has probably left Kiev, is they just need to continue their current operations, but they need, and maybe this has Belarus getting involved or whatever, but they just need to take Kiev uh, or the coastline maybe. And again, I'm no military strategist; I haven't fleshed this out.
I think if they take the coastline, that's it.
Yeah, I would agree that
That
they landlock them.
it's over. If they take Odessa, yeah, it's over.
Yeah, and
It's over.
yeah, I would agree. Odessa at this
They
point
don't
is,
even have to worry about Kharkov.
oh yeah, especially after the most likely what is the fleeing of the Ukrainian government. Kiev has become a lot less relevant, but this was before that news was even speculated. I said at the time they either need to raise an army, take Kiev, and force a peace treaty on whatever government official is left there, or they need to landlock the country, and that will be the negotiations there. Because you have to keep in mind, although there is the land border between Poland and Ukraine, which is the main avenue, well, at least one of the primary avenues for support. A lot of it has been through the sea, which is why Turkey has been such a pivotal player in all of this when it comes to Black Sea access and when it comes to the
Yeah.
politics of that, and why they were even trying to press Georgia into taking further action against the breakaway regions in Georgia or even in Russia itself. So I would say at this point, the only way for Russia to really achieve its war goals would have to be the capturing of Odessa and the securing of the sea, which is a part of the reason why they may have packed up and abandoned large parts of the Kharkov region and that theater of operation and focused a lot more on the south, and the reason why Kherson is become such a pivotal point and the reason why they're throwing everything they can at the Russian positions there to break them, because it's going to be, and I agree with what you said and I agree with what they were saying on military summary, the goal going forward has to be Kherson, Nikolaev, Odessa for any real Russian victory that isn't just Pyrrhic. And at that point, I don't even think a Pyrrhic victory is possible because the opportunity for negotiation, for the time being at least, is non existent.
Yeah, it's non-existent, and you could say that the Russian optimism um, for a negotiation was silly in hindsight. Partly because they should have known after 8 years the kind of filtration that the authorities had done would make that impossible. If anything, it was Russian generals who were more conflicted about what to do in Ukraine than Ukrainian generals when it comes right down to it. I would say, though, we're looking at now 8 days of continuous bombing. Sorry, 9. It's going to go into 10. I've already seen Telegram channels because, like, Ukraine is 6 hours ahead of us. We're recording on the Thursday. It's after 9 right now, and those attacks are still going on. Kiev has been attacked several times. Even the Iris defense system that the Germans gave to them. Of course, it's only one or two systems that they gave them, so it's hardly anything. But they have not been able to knock down the drones. I've seen a video where they shot one down and it like exploded in a civilian area. So in a way, that's even more dangerous. And then Telegram at night, when you just see them shooting at drones flying at night, they just call it an Arab wedding, um, which is cool. It's quite funny. Arab wedding again tonight. Um, what I'm getting at is 9 days after, a bridge that is already partially functioning anyways.
It was partially
Three,
functioning hours after the attack.
yeah, 300,000, uh, partial mobilization troops. Is that really because they lost Kharkov? I don't think so. I think these decisions were already being mulled in May and June. They were slow to act. Eventually, some generals had to go, and Surovodkin was put in charge. And I think he's just the last piece of this change in the war for Russia since September 21st, when they began the partial mobilization. Um, I think these things have been planned out much longer. I don't think they're just on the minute reactions.
And I'll also say this much for Kharkov, or while the withdrawals and the retreats look bad from an optic standpoint, from a PR standpoint, I believe that if it was vital for their strategy, that they would have given it what it needs, that they would have diverted troops, that they would have found some solution and not just packed up their bags and left. Because while Russia's performance in this war has certainly been underwhelming, and at times it has been incompetent as an overall strategy, I wouldn't say it has been completely incompetent. So it they would have once again gone out of their way if it was that much of a linchpin. And like I said, you could say from a political and civilizational standpoint, and even from a PR standpoint, it was the wrong move. But at the end of the day, if they if that withdrawal was some from a place that wasn't absolutely vital for them to control, then it's really not that significant. And I mean, beyond giving the Ukrainians a morale boost, which you did see a large amount of counteroffensives. You did late August, early September, or mid September, before the mobilization announcement, was very embarrassing for the Russians, admittedly, but they were able to come out of that decently. And you also brought up the drone attacks. Now, somebody had pointed out, and there's been disputes about the interception rates of these things and the effectiveness of Western provided air defenses and the effectiveness of these drones, with some of the best claims upwards of 70% of drones were intercepted. But somebody had made the point, just speaking from a purely economic standpoint, considering the fact these things cost about roughly 20,000 USD to produce. And at this point, I have no real evidence of this, but I could only speculate that instead of still buying these models from Iran, Russia probably has domestic production
Well, they
underway
have the
right.
Lancet that predates the arrival of the what are the uh
The Shaheds, I believe they are.
yeah, the Shahads. That's right.
Yeah, but point being is the Shaheds. At least I know the figure on those is about 20,000 USD. So
Yeah.
if even if they lose 70% of those, that's still a fraction of the cost of what it costs for these air defense systems to operate. And you will recall, if you have a sharp enough memory, that this is exactly what happened on the Idlib front in Syria in 2018 2019, except with Turkish drones trying to overwhelm Syrian and Russian air defenses, and what happened in the Nagorno Karabakh war in 2020, with once again Turkish provided drones trying to overwhelm Armenian air defenses.
Right. I personally, I mean, let's say they knock down 70% of them. Let's just say that that's the case. So just a 30% success rate is good enough to put 40% of the country into blackout. Like, so even if that was true, you don't even need a large success rate to do this. My own feeling is the reason this is happening is every available air defense system that they can spare is on the front lines right now. That's how obsessed they are with the front lines. And that is why their cities are suffering right now, right? Like in Chernigov right now near Sumy, the first snow fell, right? It's going to be interesting to see how far Russia will go, if if Putin will harden his heart or not. But they are counting on that. This is a psychological war now, in on the part of the Russians in a way that it hasn't been before. Um, they the amount of success they had with so few troops is still something to behold. uh, but it's not. It was insufficient, and now there is a new strategy that has obviously unfolded. Like, there's no way you bomb Ukraine this much over the Kerch Bridge. I know $3.7 billion. I get it, but it cannot mean that much. This is a much larger plan being put forward. I think the West expected that success in the summer for the Ukrainians would have come sooner. It came later, but it did. But they had hoped for, I think, much larger success because by September, Ukraine was on its seventh. Uh, what
Mobilization.
is it? On its seventh mobilization. Thank you. Um, that kind of tells you, like, basically how effective the Russians were able to hold the line despite being outnumbered. Now, it's not enough. The victory conditions have changed, and they changed very early. But the realization for that, I think, and the strategy came late for the Russians in order to rearrange the strategy. And so now that we're moving into winter, I think they see this as an advantage. And you're also looking at the like an immediate success for the Russians would have involved what we're seeing now, probably times 10. Okay. That kind of bombardment, that kind of carnage, really, probably, I think, would have pried some of the countries that are supporting Russia away. But as it stands now, Saudi Arabia is firmly on their side. They have expressed interest in joining BRICS. There was a meeting that was supposed to take place with Saudi Arabia this week. It was canceled. The
Also, around the
Americans,
same time, the news was announced that that Iran was seeking negotiations and reopening of embassies with Saudi Arabia as well.
that's right. This is a major realignment that is happening. Iran is the weak key here, the weak position, because the U.S. is basically trying for a regime change in Iran, and my speculation is that if the Russians went super hard in the beginning, yes, more lives would have been saved. But Russia isn't America, and the consequences for something like that are much graver. Nobody sanctioned America for invading, um, let's say, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. No, there are no consequences. The only consequences that come about are your own consequences for investing in it, but there are no secondary or tertiary consequences where powerful states vote against you and sanction you and
Oh
so
yes,
on.
and as you mentioned, that is as of the day of recording, it is 11 years since Gaddafi was removed from power by American-backed forces.
That's right. He was killed today, wasn't he? 11
Yes,
years ago.
yes, and this was the video got reshared again. I'm sure you all know which one I am talking
Oh,
about. So that was
it's so brutal.
yeah, that's I I didn't care to see it again. Let's put it that way. And just a
Yeah.
last couple of news items on Ukraine is that Mark Kelly, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has come out and said that, and I quote, if Ukraine falls, the current world order will collapse. So, just as we were saying, and it has become this battlefield where everyone is sinking everything they can into it. And if I would say Russian victory is not secured within the next few months, and I'm being very arbitrary with that time frame because a lot can happen, a lot can change under the circumstances. This is going to become a much larger war. I'm not predicting a NATO intervention or anything at this point, but the longer this goes on, the more you risk this turning into a proper global conflict, even more than it already is.
I think so. I think that is something I can't I mean the Americans kind of have an off ramp, but they kind of don't. So like their major off ramp is they got that what they wanted. They have a Europe now that is completely subjugated to them. We'll get into the European use to flesh out basically what I'm implying here. The dollar has been saved. Some of the benefits will be some of these companies will be migrating to the U.S. and so that's a bit of an off ramp for the U.S. But after Afghanistan last year, the look is particularly bad, and I still don't see any cracks with China, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Um, there are other countries of less consequence, but these are big countries and emerging markets, some of them that have exceeded Western markets. You look at Britain and how much trouble it's in right now. You can well guess how stressful. Europe is going to be stressed in a way that it hasn't in over 80 years, in nearly a century. And it's going to fundamentally change the West in a very
Oh
big
yes,
way.
and I'm glad you also have brought that up because I do have quite a bit of European news to get into, and I'll actually start with this because you had brought up China and you had brought up American subjugation of Europe. That China, just over the past several years, has had their state-backed companies investing in Mediterranean ports, and
Mm.
that includes in countries like Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Morocco, and Egypt, but also non-Mediterranean ports in Europe, which include ports also in France and Spain on the northern coast, and also in Belgium and the Netherlands. And you'll recall it was on the eve of 2021. I think it was actually December 30th, 2020. There was a massive trade deal signed between the European Union and China that the outgoing Trump administration threw a fit about. And there have been these deals continuing yet again. And keep in mind that was in 2020, and everyone speculated that China would lose so much credibility from the leak, from the lab leak, that it would cease to be a global power. And once again, I think probably the only country that outdoes China when it comes to analysts having bad predictions is Russia. And I would say Russia still takes the crown for that, but China is a close second. And although you do have a Europe that has been completely whipped by the United States and put in a very submissive position, and has also been forced to be against Russia, and has also had a lot of Russian anti-Russian sentiment stoked there. At the same time, you also have China coming in to pick up a lot of the slack, and in both inside and outside the European Union. You'll recall Chinese investment in somewhere like Serbia has been massive over the past several years. In places like Italy, in places like Germany, Germany and China have been growing in economic relations once again for the past several years. So, although it does seem, at least for the time being, Russian influence has been stamped out of Europe, you could very well see a case where Chinese influence is starting to fill that gap, especially in some of these countries that are, let's just say, less bonded with the U.S. in a real sense, such as Germany, which is effectively a colony, or the U.K., which is uh, part of that Anglo-American sphere. So it does create an interesting situation. And hell, you may even get a case where the UK is more apt to go towards China if the news about the pound does continue to go the way it goes. But I think it's interesting that Chinese investments are actually that high in Europe because whenever you hear about Chinese investments, it's always in Africa, it's always in Southeast Asia, it's always in the Middle East, which those are large areas of investment for China. But they overlook that when it comes to economic influence, it's also growing exponentially in Europe. And while, like I said, the Russian influence may have been stamped out, Chinese influence in Europe will continue to grow and probably will be the biggest stumbling block to a complete submission. Although I would say for the time being, Europe is put under a complete submission, and with that, I would say, yeah, for the next several years, Europe's going to be completely bent to the U.S. But that once again creates more opportunity for Chinese investment and Chinese influence to grow in Europe. So at that point, I suppose, yeah, you can have the debate which would be worse, and maybe as the American empire becomes much more imposing on Europe, people will start to prefer China. I'm not making any predictions like that, but that is an area of possibility that we could see unfold with over the course of the 2020s.
Well, you have to ask yourself, how much richer is America going to get from acquiring Europe, right? I'll give you an example. So the EU promised all the countries that lent their military hardware for the Ukrainian war effort that they would be reimbursed at 85%. Poland went knocking on Brussels' door and asked for their reimbursement. And I mean, if we're looking at European countries, they basically gave the most. The EU said, the coffers are depleted. We cannot give you 85%. We can give you 46%, but not 85. Now, understand that there's $75 billion for COVID relief that Poland is still waiting for, and the EU is using their displeasure of the Polish constitution and the way the Polish courts are organized and framed. Let's say uh, it's a reason to withhold the money, right? So this is a very delicate time. So who is going to like obviously NATO is being depleted, and in a sense, you're being told that NATO can't re fill the military hardware bases that they need.
Yeah, there was actually an interesting case with Poland where they were offloading a lot of old Soviet model tanks in expectation that Germany would compensate with a one for one for their more modern tanks. But
Yeah,
I think that ended up being like an actual like 1 to 3 ratio. For every three they sent to Ukraine, Germany would compensate with one.
right, right. So they're not going to get it, right? And of course, China is going to come into this region. They're going to expand uh, their economic holdings there. Why? Well, because America can't, right? And the reason America left Afghanistan last year is because America cannot fund Afghanistan and Ukraine at the same time. This is why it had to happen, and probably explains why in April 2021, why this war almost started then. Uh, my guess is they wanted out of Afghanistan before they would, go to war, before they would, increase shelling on Donbass as a pretext to start the war, the casus belli. So, um, where is the finance going to come from, right? Like, this is what I mean about an off ramp, right? Optically, if they don't want to see Europe plunge into a Children of Men scenario, if anybody has seen that film, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you don't want to see Europe in that state, because if Europe goes to that state, America's control of Europe will wane, right? It'll be a breaking point. We are already going to see more homelessness. Uh, who knows what we're going to see? But even Ukraine was supplying energy to Europe. It no longer can, right? It was supplying a certain percentage of its overall energy capacity to Europe, and now that has been turned off, which is exacerbating the situation. Um, Inflation is all double digit now, in every country. Industrial inflation is through the roof. There was an interesting post on Telegram by Morgoth where he mentions five, six different companies ranging in age from 83 to 135 years of age, companies that produce products that are eventually used by car manufacturers, confectionery companies, the whole gambit.
Yeah,
And he's
I just do have a few of
yeah.
those, and this is from Disclosed TV.
Oh, sorry.
So it's far from the full list that you're referring to, that Morgoth, which I know which one you're referring to, but just to give a brief idea, 125 years after foundation, German construction company Wolf Hawk is insolvent. After 130 years, confectionery manufacturer Bodetta insolvent. After 156 years, German automotive supplier Borges is insolvent, and like they're even a big operator in the United States. They have like
Mm,
plants within like all over the U.S. and abroad. So once again,
I didn't know that.
you'll probably see a lot of them relocate. So yeah. I mean, and once again, that goes for a lot of these companies. A lot of these companies do exist outside of Germany as well, and that will have rolling impacts, whether that be the closure of those branches or probably in the case of the U.S. and China, relocation to those as well. And then just one last one that's close ahead was the soap maker Kapos, after 170 years, is insolvent. And this is all within a 24-hour period that they announced this. And again, you went over the list of 83 countries, you mentioned that. And then you also have to consider these are the ones who just announced on that day, when there's probably
Right.
more who haven't already but will in the near future. So
Mm,
this is something that we have not seen the end of, and that this is actually just a peek into what 2023 will look like. And while a lot of people have been calling it a recession, which, I mean, keep in mind, recession was just a term that they had created so they didn't have to use the term depression to avoid invoking imagery from the 1930s. But in Europe, for now, and probably within the next year in the United States after it spills over, we're heading towards a depression. People will be financially ruined. And the entire base of the industrial economy, in Europe at least, will be financially ruined. It will probably take a pretty big hit in the US after a temporary rise, after they get a little bit of scraps from whatever comes out of Europe. I mean, but how long will that realistically last? And at this point, I suppose Europe is about to become the dream of Ted Kaczynski, completely deindustrialized, industrial civilization, and completely abolished. But I will say, for the Industrial Revolution and all its consequences, I greatly fear that in post-industrial society will be far worse than what industrial society has given us.
yeah.
And there's a term out there, fourth world country, and that refers to, and maybe we'll actually get some concrete examples, but it's a theoretical concept that refers to a first world country that has fallen into third world standards. Because with a lot of these third world countries, they still have a lot of those traditions and a lot of those ways of life that still allow them to survive despite their poor living conditions compared to second and third world countries where
Mm,
again they have local supply chains, they have people who specialize in things, and it's like an economy that's like 100 150 years in the past. But if you have a first or second world industrial economy that collapses, like you probably will in much of Europe, you don't have people with those skill sets. And probably the
right.
closest example we've seen to a fourth world country, and I would say that it didn't even quite get to the levels that maybe even Europe will get to this winter and this upcoming year, is post-Soviet Russia and the post-Soviet republics, where yeah, a lot of people died because there was a collapse in basic state function. A lot of people didn't know how to make up for it, and one of the things that always gets cited about post-90s Russia is that after a couple of years of it, after people realized things weren't returning to normal anytime soon, you had a large uptick in personal gardens. And that is actually what kept a lot of people alive in Russia through the 1990s, is that they were able to cultivate their own food. So take that for what you will. I personally like that piece of advice, and I'll try to expand whatever operation I have, personally speaking, because that may be the case. And I will say once again, some pieces of unofficial advice. If you haven't been doing this since at least 2020, which I would expect most of you have, add some more canned food to that stockpile in the storage room, because you're gonna need it eventually. Especially if you're in Europe, I would say, yeah, get what you can, stock up, supply, and really just be prepared for these kind of things. Do I think it's going to be a complete collapse into an anarchic state? Maybe not at first. Maybe not even in the near future. But as these social and economic conditions degrade, you will also get more lawlessness out of this. And maybe
Yep.
it won't be complete lawlessness, but it will be where you
You'll
might
have
not.
private police
Yeah.
for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, the best scenario I can think to compare this to, and it certainly won't be a one for one because no comparison's ever a one for one, is a lot of Europe over 2023. Maybe not at first. Maybe winter will just be a bit painful, but the effects of that winter will be felt throughout the rest of the year and the years to come. The Again, the best comparison I can make is a post-Soviet republic is going to be the large state of a large part of Europe, especially in Germany, especially in these heavy industrialized parts of Europe. That's what you can look forward to.
Right. There. I mean, we've spoken about this before that the winter of 23, 24 will probably be even worse because now they're. I mean, purchase of Russian oil is like 50% higher than it was last year in the EU. So they're getting as much of it as they can right now. And even that, even a country like the UK, which does not depend greatly on Russian gas and oil, uh, has said that they are going to have blackouts between 4 and 7 p.m. And I mean, who would have thought, right? A really interesting article that popped up was somebody reposted a George Soros. You can find it on the George Soros website, by the way. But in 1993, he penned an article describing what the West has to prepare for now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, because he looked at that arrangement as a kind of world order. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, he looked for a new world order, and that America would have to be a kind of a policeman. Now, he already had suspicions that Russia, even back then, might not comply. Um, it worried him that Russia wanted to be an equal partner with America and even be accepted into NATO to, be a new world order arrangement that, was beyond the pale for George Soros. So what he said was the major thing that's stopping the West, stopping America, uh, from really truly implementing this, uh, you know, policeman status of the world, is that its population, even its political class, cannot accept the kind of loss of life that would be necessary in order to bring it about, which by extension means a war with Russia. He did, however, mention that Eastern Europe could supply the willing population to fight this war.
Yeah, and
So
I remember it
29,
was like a
29 years later, here we are.
yeah, and I remember seeing that piece and where somebody had actually made the joke. It's like, well, what Eastern European nation would be crazy enough to turn itself into a meat grinder to serve the interests of the American Empire? And I suppose, I suppose we've gotten answers to that already. And once again, it, a lot of what these people want to do, they'll just outright say, like that, like
Mhm.
Russia needs to be crushed, and we're going to recruit a bunch of Eastern European nationalists and play on their old ethnic tensions into doing it. And it's really plain as day, really because, like most evil, they don't see themselves as evil. They think this is a righteous cause to completely crush a nation
Yes.
rather than cooperate with it on an equal footing and let bygones be bygones. I mean, it is a rather, given Soros's, let's just say, ethnic and personal background, not much of a surprise coming from somebody like him. And then, of course, the kind of people who collaborate with him, even if they aren't of that particular ethnic background. None of this is really shocking, but it. I can't remember who said it about evil just being a very like mundane and boring thing, and I think our current crop of elites and people like Soros just go to show that.
Right, right. And, this makes me think of, to an extent, Kissinger, but Kissinger via Morgoth's post because he said all these companies that are now shuttering that have been around for over a century, they have survived Marxism, two world wars, revolutions, but they could not survive friendship with America. And that reminds me of, we were talking about this off there, Kissinger's statement, to be, what is it? To be an enemy of America
Is
is dangerous,
dangerous, yes.
but to be a friend is lethal.
Yes. And if you want me to bolster that statement again, here are just some quick figures on the deindustrialization of Europe as a whole. This is excluding just Germany in particular, but just the entirety of Europe and this entirety of the European Union in particular. So, fertilizer production down 70%, aluminum down 50%, silicon down 27%, steel down 17%, paper and packaging down 15%. 100% of zinc smelters have been shut down or forced to cut back on their business, and the total size of the chemical industry across the European Union has decreased by 40%, all because of natural gas shortage. Now, keep in mind that isn't just the energy needed to keep the lights on in these plants. Again, and a lot of nuclear advocates will not shut up about this, which I'll get into. That can be taken care of by nuclear. But when it comes to petroleum and natural gas, a lot of the products you actually refine out of it, rather than just energy purposes, are needed for this sort of production. For example, there's a reason they call it the petrochemical industry because it's
Yes,
not so much the oil they or the gas they need to keep the lights on. And again, we've seen in France the nuke plants can actually do that, and nuclear energy does have its merits. I'm not completely anti-nuclear. I wouldn't even say I'm anti-nuclear. I'm just a bit of a skeptic. I'll just put it that way, and I'll just leave it at that. But point being is, you even see the industrial sector in France suffer because they don't have the materials they need to produce that, a lot of which come from oil and natural gas.
that's right. Excellent point.
And with that, Germany has, in a surprisingly wise move, decided to extend the life of the plants that they had scheduled to shut down, the nuclear plants that they had scheduled to shut down. So I suppose that will help them keep the lights on for a few more hours a day, but once again, it doesn't address that question of complete industrial collapse and the petrochemical and the petroleum products, I should say, that you actually need for a great deal of manufacturing, especially when it comes to the industry we had mentioned, such as auto manufacturing, such as the chemical industry. And with that, you also have the massive inflation numbers in Europe. Let me see. I believe I can get a list right here just for a brief overview. So now these are the official numbers. So European Union as a whole is 10.9, Germany is 10.9, UK is 10.1, Italy 9.4, Spain 9%, Ireland 8.6, and that's all to compare it to the 8.2% inflation rate in Europe. So while it's not favorable in the US, you can certainly see where the US is scraped off of much of the European Union in order to keep theirs a couple of points down from the rest of Europe. And then, in his infinite wisdom, in a great deal of damage control, Chancellor Olaf Scholz comes out and says there's no reason to be afraid of the rising prices at this time.
If you have a lot of money, there isn't.
Yeah, I suppose it's somebody in the position of a prime minister probably would have ample motivation to say something like that. And again, if I were that detached from my public, I would probably say something like that. Not that I think that even a lot of the guys on our side are too in touch with the reality of the common person, but I don't know, they at least feign it better. I'll put it that way.
Hmm.
And just to continue on with some brief European news, Qatar has said that Europe will not be receiving any additional gas for this winter. So that as an avenue has been has been closed off. You have Berlusconi. I don't have the full text, but had made some full comments on the Ukraine war, more or less blaming NATO and said that we gave Russia no choice to do what it did. You have Bulgaria, the prime minister has officially protested that Zelensky gave a speech to parliament, and Bulgaria, for the past several months, probably since about the summer, has been a thorn in the side of the war effort, especially when it comes to the production of the ammunition needed for a lot of Ukrainian weapons that are still from the Soviet era. Bulgaria is one of the few countries that actually still produces those. So you have more and more discontent coming out of some of these smaller European nations given the cost of this war effort. Then I have two other European stories, both of which are only semi-related to the current crisis, and actually, I would say one semi-related to the current crisis, one is completely unrelated. I'll start with one that's semi-related, which I wanted to bring up earlier, and I should have brought up earlier, is that the Royal Air Force's affirmative action programs has forced many RAF pilots forced in retirement to lend their services to China. And people are saying, and it's actually funny, I know somebody, and I won't name this person because, I don't know if this person would want me to reference them by name on the show, but this was like 2019, 2020, saying that any intelligent non-Western nation, whether it be Russia or China, or even some of these places, like some of these larger countries in the so-called global South, like Argentina, Brazil, or some of the more developed African countries in the Middle East, will offer incentives to disenfranchised white professionals in
Yeah.
the Anglosphere and in Europe in order to fill the gaps in their society because they've been pushed out of their society. And this could be a continuing trend that and I this is actually the first real example we see of this happening, and of course it's for something as vital as military training. And I mean, this can spill over into a lot of other professionals that have been screwed over by a lot of these programs. So I would expect more out of China. Russia's probably off the table because of the current crisis right now, but even like places like Brazil and Argentina certainly do have that potential to scalp a lot of these. And of course, I'll clarify for the YouTube censors. I mean that in the metaphorical sense, in the sense that you might scalp tickets at a baseball game. But in terms of that, they may peel off a lot of these professionals and put them to their own use while they have been furloughed or mothballed by their own society. And really, a lot of people from all across the political spectrum, especially the mainstream right, were very angry that these RAF pilots would dare to do this. And to which case, I would say number one, Britain is not at war with China, so by no means it could even be construed as treason. Number two, they've been rejected by their own society. They're skilled men with very valuable skills that they can make quite a living off of. What do you expect them to do? What, go to Poland? I mean, who do you think is going to pay more for flight instructors, Poland or China? And I mean, yeah, just to put that in perspective, and keep in mind, the RAF for years, considering its budget, considering its size, has been one of those air forces that always punches above its weight.
Yeah, there's nothing. I mean, we've said it on the show many times. There's nothing in it. If you're in a Western country, there's nothing in it for you if you're white. There are all kinds of programs, whether they're civilian or military, where hiring quotas rigidly do not accept white men. There's nothing in it for you, right? Like after all the ritual humiliation of our history, they still then expect you to be patriotic, with a lower income, or join their military and go fight and die for a country that thinks you're garbage, thinks your entire history and identity is garbage. Um, Good for them. The article I read said about 30 pilots, both with fast combat jets and combat helicopters, had gone to China to train the Chinese in basically counter warfare should they get into a conflict with the US, right? Good for them. It's not their fault. I mean, obviously,
I mean, if anything, they didn't betray their nation; they were betrayed by their nation.
exactly, exactly. You get what you deserve. You get what you deserve. I mean, look at the Tories and the nonsense that's happened. Liz Truss, 45 days at 10 Downing Street, right? The Tories actually exceeded Blair. I know Blair set up the groundwork for mass immigration, but the fact of the matter is, the Tories literally broke every record last year. 1 million migrants and immigrants. 1 million. That's a small city.
Well, that's just the nature of the Anglosphere conservative, isn't it? Going above and beyond whatever policy you opposed 8 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they have the sort of infection that many of the American vassal states do, right? Like, uh, Germany is a prime example. Schultz, Baerbock, these politicians are very eager to even outdo their American masters, to prove their loyalty, to prove how obedient they are. And in many ways, that's what the Tory party is. The Tory party is to the New Labour what these little, what these European countries are to the U.S. Um, they'll go out of their way because, of course, the Tory party is a filtration process. It's where right wingers and conservatives who want to preserve the country are filtered out. That's its purpose. But New Labour always looks at them with an eye of suspicion that they could be taken over, that the filtration process could break down. Right.
And
That's why liberals in America have the same kind of fear over the Republicans, because now you have two camps. You have the MAGA camp and you have the Rhino camp.
yeah, and you brought up the Tory party, which I'm glad you did, in the very embarrassing short tenure of Liz Truss as Prime Minister of the UK. No word on who her replacement will be yet, but as you said, a possibly record breaking 45 days when it comes to this. That, keep in mind, just shy of 3 years ago, this was December 2019, the Tories, the British Conservative Party, won by some of the largest margins seen in British electoral history. And since then, and that was Boris Johnson, the whole Get Brexit Done campaign, as you recall, he wanted to go in with a fresh mandate and more support, that they had actually gained seats on that, and then oversaw Brexit in the early days of 2020. And then his government collapses, which turns into Truss's government, which collapsed after a record 45 days. And I mean, I would think at least it's inevitable that this is going to have to go to the polls eventually. And the Tories are putting that off because
Oh yeah.
they know they squandered all the political capital they have. And keep in mind, Labor, and I don't even know if Corbyn's still in charge, but whatever.
Oh no, Corbyn's gone.
Yeah, I thought they cast him aside after the whole.
It's just drama.
Oh yeah, that's right. But point being is whatever, let's say, very intelligent individuals in charge there also isn't offering that great of an alternative. But I suppose that's just what democracy is. But point being is the Tories know that they have pissed away every bit of political capital that they had garnered from that landslide election, and that it certainly will look like the opposite direction if this is forced to go to the polls again. Which at this point, it's going to be forced to go to the. I mean, this is exactly what happened within the Italian government, where and happened several times within the Italian government. There's actually, I believe, the Economist actually went as far as to compare the two countries at this point and said that the level of political dysfunction is, again, using Italy as a standard bearer of that, is at Italian levels when it comes to parliamentary democracy. And that's also one of the bigger weaknesses of parliamentary democracy is that nobody's forced to serve out a mandate. Whereas, of course, there's the impeachment process in the United States, and I imagine there's probably something similar in the French presidential systems. In these presidential systems, unless something goes like drastically wrong and you could get like the vast majority of the legislature behind it, you're stuck with that government until it serves its term and gets either leaves or gets quote unquote voted out. But with these parliamentary systems, you can change them like underwear. You can throw them out like yesterday's trash, and I mean, that has its benefits, especially if you're a fan of instability, which I would argue many of you may be. Or I would say the parliamentary system actually is probably better for getting in, let's just say, more fringe quote unquote ideas, which I would say it is, and that's why some of these more rightist countries in Europe are from parliamentary systems. But point being is, you're seeing at what was one point the pinnacle of democracy across the world, up there with America, and again it was always those Anglo-American values, has turned to complete political dysfunction, and this is on top of the economic crisis previously laid out, and this is also on top of a story that got swept under the rug. And I have a semi-related story in France that of the street brawls between Indian and Pakistani communities,
Hmm.
and that was like probably about 3 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So you have that political, economic, and social dysfunction all coming to a head in the UK, and
Well, I
really,
mean, just to quickly interject, I read one article uh, just before Liz Truss's resignation. There was a motion within the Tory party whether to pass a bill for fracking. And apparently, this caused like such a row uh, that the guards had to participate. And you had people who were literally grabbed and forced and said, "You have to sign it," dragged into the room to sign it. Uh, like really, really remarkable stuff happening in the UK, unprecedented. I like, you know, I've been around a while, and I can tell you that in a half a century, I haven't seen anything like this.
yeah, that's yeah, I can only co-sign what you say because I certainly wasn't around for it, but I would say the last story for Europe I have is really something you that has been going on since then, but you haven't heard about in any great sense really since 2017, 2018. It's really even by people on our side, and I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but it has been more or less swept under the rug or pushed to the wayside that a lot of the social and crime issues related to mass migration are continuing to
Oh
this
yeah.
day. And there was that
Hmm.
case out of France where
Yes,
there
Lola.
were Algerian nationals living in France committed a pretty brutal murder of a 12-year-old. So
The details are so
I'm not
disgusting.
even going to get it on the show, but I'll just leave it at that, and I'll just say it was a very brutal and depraved murder. And at the same time, and again, I feel like I've been transported back to 2018 with a lot of these points, which I mean, don't get me wrong, they all hold up. That you have Macron getting out there and giving some weepy statement, a Trudeau style weepy statement about the riots in Algeria in 1962 and French colonialism and the evils of that within like a day of this incident. And
Hours.
oh, hours, excuse me. And then you did have some pushback against this. France is one of those few countries where you actually do get public pushback, and there was I had seen this today. There was a French right wing journalist named Damien Raoult who was assaulted by pro migrant activists during a protest over this. So once again, you do have that, and like I said, this feels very reminiscent of a lot of the migrant crisis talk from about 2015 to 2018 before it really just completely fell off the radar. Because in 2019, 2020, there was a brief curtailment, especially in 2020. But, and I'll get into some of the news about the caravan of lights on the Greek Turkish border. But with that, you did have uh, a brief pause. But the crisis related to this, and you can go through and you still find these stories every once in a while. They're not as frequently reported as they used to be, at least on this side. That things like this happen on a very regular basis. Now, it isn't as bad as when you had the weekly truck attacks. Don't get it. It hasn't slightly improved since then. But a lot of these communities that have been here that have become embedded, no, the social situation has not changed. No, these a lot of this crime has not curtailed. A lot of assimilation that you would have expected to happen at this point has not happened. And it also goes back to the point where I once again consider France one of those countries that it can either be the biggest winner in Europe or it can be the biggest loser in Europe because given its two trajectories, there's really no middle ground for them. And at some point, they're going to either be subsumed by this and all their other consequences of their policies, of their liberal policies, or they're also the ones, in my opinion at least, with the greatest potential to reverse a lot of this and, in fact, have cascading effects on other European countries as well once they, I mean, as the saying goes, France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So, I mean, I just saw this story and while I am once again also guilty of ignoring a lot of these stories and not reporting them and considering them secondary news, I do think it's important to bring these things up. And maybe it was just the particularly brutal details of this case that really brought it to my attention. But this is the first time I've seen people talk about this in like this amount in about 4 years.
Hmm. Well, remember, in Sweden, there was a guy who he took a car, or he hijacked a bus, and he's just dismembered a young girl of like 9 or 10. Her grave is always desecrated. It's desecrated, it's fixed up, and it's desecrated again. You had this ridiculous Chinese American woman who went to Sweden to work, and she's astonished by the xenophobia. Well, you know what? Europe is it's coming to a breaking point. I'll bring up Morgoth again. He talked about, can woke survive, the coming crisis? Probably not. Uh, but can social cohesion survive? Forget wokeness. That'll be the first fatality. And I do think that on some subconscious level, right? Like liberals, um, for them, we've discussed this off air, but for them, like, you know, the climate crisis 2030, oh my God, that's their Armageddon. Okay. And that's why they think, like, if we stop fossil fuels, of course they don't have a real plan about how that's going to happen in the next 10 years while they're funding a war, and that's really what's the driving force behind
And
it.
once again, to touch on it, a lot of these people also don't realize the derivative industries of fossil fuels that isn't just using them from energy. Once again, going back to the
Exactly.
petroleum products, a lot of these people really, and I wouldn't even call them dumb because I mean a lot of them just are of average intelligence and take that for what it is. But again, a lot of them are just completely ignorant of the fact that yeah, we use these for more than putting gas in our car.
Right, like, uh, do these people even realize how important fuel is to maintain an army, a
Oh,
modern
absolutely
army?
not.
Like, what are they going to do? They're going to have a force of laser robots with nuclear engines inside them, and that's how they're going to, like, they are so out of touch, so out of touch. You see
Are you telling me we're
ridiculous
not getting the
videos.
Tesla half tracks?
Yeah, yeah. You see these ridiculous videos where they've gone, where they're desecrating a painting by Van Gogh. Yes, I know it was covered in over under a sheet of glass, but the point is they've done this to other paintings, and what they're basically saying is like the core identity of what it is to be a European symbolically should be desecrated in order to survive this incredible climate catastrophe that's coming, right? And it is this ideology which is, driving, a certain amount of cohesion or obedience, um, even for the war, right? Because it's going to help Europe become green. It's lunacy. I I can't believe in any way, like when Biden says that, what's happening now in this war, this crisis, is not going to curtail our commitment to transferring to a green economy. I cannot believe he's serious when he says that. That it can't be. That's idiotic. This is a virtue signal. What I think is happening is they realize the liberal order is falling apart. And talking about 2030 and climate collapse, and this is why we have to do everything, is a way to avert direct attention to liberalism itself, right? Because wokeness is probably not going to survive depending on how harsh this crisis is, and probably social cohesion won't either.
Oh, absolutely. And people, especially at the beginning of this war, love to break out the World War II comparisons, and even at the beginning of the COVID crisis, they would say like, "Well, if we could turn our economy around in 1941 and manufacture all those weapons we needed to win World War II, we can make more ventilators." I'm sure you all remember that sort of rhetoric,
Mhm.
but that once again, putting aside just the different material realities of that, just getting into the social and civilizational questions, the fact that realistically, especially in America's case, like from 1941 to at that point 2020, or I suppose 2022 at this point, fundamentally not the same country, not the same social structure, and even not the same demographic makeup. And I would say especially not the same demographic makeup when it comes to this. And it,
Mhm.
it becomes this sense of delusion. I believe this is something we've been saying about the Green Movement for quite some time. That the West does know it is on a horizon. It does know that it is at the end of some road, and that things will start to deteriorate from here because we have overplayed our hand and did not properly prepare for the future. But they can make people feel good by saying it's to save the earth. It's so we all don't. It's so you don't go outside in
Yeah, yeah.
yeah in your like Arctic home and it's 110 degrees and the
It's
ice
a
caps
balm
melt
to
and the pole.
soothe
Yeah.
the wound.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. It's a sedative. I'll put it that way.
Hmm.
And then that's exasperated by this current crisis right here. So I mean, I really don't know what else to say about all of this. And it's I don't please don't come to me for solutions because I have solutions, but I don't see a feasible way out of this. And at this point, yeah, wokeness will be the first to go. It is a state-backed civic religion, and it's something that they can drop on a dime. We've seen them do it before. We in fact saw that with the implementation of like wokeness, and I would attribute that. Of course, you can point to other versions and like what may be considered like wokeness back then. As much as I hate the term, but it was really like probably 2010, like around the time Obama got elected and really took office, when we had the first black president, and then of course the Ferguson incident and BLM, and then the whole LGBTQ CIA thing, and again all those things grow out from one another as we've seen over the past several years. But while they won't completely abandon the social liberal ideology, they will curtail its excess. And you actually already see some of this, where they will criticize or throw under the bus some of the more extreme elements while reinforcing a lot of the moderate elements. For example, there's a reason why all of a sudden you have a number of gay rights groups and feminist groups who are all of a sudden, up until 2 years ago they were fine with it, all of a sudden have think this has gone too far, or oh the liberal who, and you see this all the time on conservative media, oh the liberal who was on board with all of this until 2018, but then after a certain point woke up and realized, oh wow, this has gone too far, surely it will stop eventually. And at this point I think material reality is going to force it to stop, at least to a great degree. But once again, you're already seeing them preparing for this by throwing the more vanguardist and the more radical elements under the bus while shoring up a lot of the more quote unquote moderate elements of this. And yeah, I mean, they'll get rid of this at the first crisis they get because a lot of this is just unsustainable, especially in a time of crisis. But don't get me wrong, they're going to keep as much as they feasibly can.
Right. The core tenet that don't worry, no matter how hard it is, this is just part of the transition. This war is a test, and and it's also driving us to where we want to go, anyways. Right.
Yes.
That element will be there definitely, right? And you can see how, you see videos of Tony Blair, who doesn't want this factional fighting, and he just wants it to work. He wants to go beyond ideology. It's a question of competence and talent and so on and so on. You can see the reasoning for this, right? Like why that would be necessary. However, this reasoning, coupled with an economic downturn, will mean certain groups that have been privileged groups, right? They're going to suspect that this kind of rhetoric means they're going to suffer because they've had a lot of reinforcing rhetoric during the Trump years, right? That can't stop. And you can see what kind of a bind they're in, right? And they've brought it on themselves. They've completely brought it on themselves. if the if leadership in the West continues into this incompetence, then we're going to see really, really spectacular things from tomorrow till the next 3 years.
Yeah, I don't really think there's any other way to put that. But speaking of competent versus incompetent leadership, I do have some Middle Eastern news. And
Yeah.
um, look, I've gotten to Erdogan before, but I can't believe I'm saying this. He is the most okay, I should take that back because you also do have Viktor Orban still in NATO, but he is one of the most competent leaders within
Oh yeah.
NATO at this point. And the proposals for Turkey to become a gas hub have been officiated, and I believe that also does include the new construction of a pipeline that will be a joint venture between both Russia and Turkey. So they have secured that victory. They will have immense leverage over Europe for not only this winter but the coming future because on top of their current energy crisis, I mean, keep in mind these are pipelines that originate from Azerbaijan, pipelines that originate from Russia, pipelines that originate from the Arabian Peninsula, especially Qatar. You had the discussion about Qatar. So, and who knows? Maybe even Iranian pipelines one day. And we'll see what those Chinese funds are able to provide. But excuse me, we'll see what those Chinese funds are able to provide and what kind of projects they embark. And you could see a three-way project between Russia, China, and whoever they're constructing with. So there is that possibility going into the future. Around the same time, interesting enough, and I don't attribute these two things, but the Caravan of Lights, which was about a million-man caravan that was set to go from Turkey into Europe, was disbanded once it reached the border, and that was around the time that the gas hub agreement was announced. So
Hmm.
that crisis has been curtailed for now. But I mean, once again, they've shown that they can throw together these million-strong caravans and shove them into Europe more or less at any time that they want. And especially with this energy crisis, they now have two vectors of just complete leverage over Europe, making them, although the figures won't reflect it, although the experts won't tell you, making Turkey one of the most powerful countries in the world and making Erdogan one of the most powerful men in the world at this time. But you've had that deal go through. You've also had them follow through a lot of what they want to do on Syria because their Syrian proxies, as was mentioned with the agreement, have been cut off, and a lot of them have turned on it. And I believe you were saying it was they were
Yeah.
engaged with the Third Corps, which is one of the few remaining pro-Turkish proxies left in Syria. Where
So
you,
this is very
yeah, go
interesting.
ahead.
Um, Last week I mentioned that Afrin fell to HTS, Al-Sham Tahrir. Anyways, I'm just going to call it HTS. It's been ages since I've had to mention the full name. This is an Al Qaeda affiliated group, okay, and it has smaller subgroups beneath it that work with it. Third Corps, I believe, is a group that's associated with the Free Syrian Army. It works with Turkey. Now, there were clashes initially after Afrin was taken. And Afrin, at one time, I think, was Kurdish held. So Afrin, these clashes between Third Corps and HTS and company occurred, and then they decided to mend their ways. All of them have some degree of funding from Turkey, and my guess is HTS gets funding from other states besides Turkey, which is why they did what they did. And a lot of people even protested in the region because they were afraid that the peace deal that the Russians and the Turks had figured out there would fall apart. So then what Russia did is they began aggressively bombing them. They didn't just bomb them around Afrin and the border towns north of Afrin, but they began bombing them inside that tiny part of Idlib, pardon me, as well. So HTS withdrew its troops from there, and Turkish troops went in. There are only a few HTS groups now in that region, which means Turkey is very serious about where relations with Russia are going. On top of this, America, imposed sanctions that would block cooperation between Russia and their Mir card with the Turkish economy. However, this week, a new bank has been opened up where a separate card will be introduced where this will take place, effectively cutting off America's influence. Now, the way things are going, you have to think is there going to be a regime change attempt in Turkey and Saudi Arabia, right? Because they are losing their footing here. And basically, what Erdogan is saying is what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it, right? I've got a lucrative deal. We last year we talked about his crazy policy to lower the value of the lira, and like he was like imitating what the Russians had did, but it worked out for them, but it wasn't working out for him. This deal is going to, I think, potentially rescue the Turkish economy. Ultimately, that's what Erdogan wants. And it's going to supply Southern Europe, particularly the Balkans, with energy, right? Which would pull influence away from America, right? Because they're not getting it via Germany anymore. So, what will America do? Will it blow up another pipeline? How desperate will it get?
Oh yes,
Right.
and we actually talked about this, and I had sent you that article from Hungary today about the increase in security in Turk Stream
Yeah.
upon the demolition of Nord Stream 1 and 2. Well, of course, Germany is a much more pliant member of the American Empire. It's a much more pliant client state. Whereas, I mean, some of these countries in the Balkans are still outside of the European Union. And, I mean, at this point, I think Serbia is the only one that's actually still outside of NATO. So,
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
yeah, so they're completely surrounded by other NATO countries. But point being is, quite a few of them are still outside of the European Union, including Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and I don't think Albania is in there yet. No, Albania is not in there. But you have that, and even the ones who are within the European Union and NATO are like, and I think Hungary is probably the prime example of this, are less ruly than Germany, and will be more likely to push back. And these are also countries, especially like Hungary and Turkey and Serbia, who are much more conciliatory towards Russia. So the destruction of Turk Stream will not probably not be met with the same pliance as we saw the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines met with. So while I don't put it past them to try to attempt that, it may not have as stunning results as, say, what we saw with the Nord Stream destruction, and would be. Let's put it this way: it would be a much larger gamble to demolish Turk Stream than it was to demolish the Nord Stream pipelines.
Right. Right. That's a good point because Erdogan is just saying, "Go ahead, tempt me." Because what is happening right now is that now there is a economic front, a bloc has been formed on the Eastern Front with cooperation between Russia and Turkey, and it's affecting everything on the east side of that in Syria, as well as on the west side of that, Europe.
Yes, and because you had brought up the Syrian opposition, I just do have one last piece of news out of Syria and Turkey. With their recent actions, Turkey said that the only way for lasting peace in Syria was for a reconciliation between the Syrian government and the opposition, which is something that they have been saying since the first announcements that they would be cutting off support for a lot of these groups. So it does appear, and I don't think this is anyone shocked, that they're trying to force a more legitimate opposition, a more political opposition in Syria that still will be their wedge there, that still will be their eyes and ears in Syria, given that question, because although Erdogan has been adopting anti-Western posturing, he's not exactly pro-Russia or pro-Russian bloc at this point. Again, he's the ultimate middleman. He's the power broker between the two blocs. So his loyalties haven't completely flipped. Now maybe
Yeah.
he'll be pushed further and further east as Western policy becomes more and more, let's just say, self-destructive. But let's not pretend like he's going to just become a puppet state of Russia and Putin. So
No.
he is still trying to force an opposition in Syria. It's just that it'll be a non-armed, more politically legitimate opposition, which he'll still be able to use to to put pressure on Syria and on Russia. So, I mean, that's kind of the outcome I was expecting to this war, that Turkey would eventually come to the table. And I mean, hell, you even saw back in 2018, 2019, France and Germany would attend these summits that were in Turkey with Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So it looks like, with the exclusion of France and Germany, given the current situation between them and Russia, they've been excluded. It looks like it will be the pact of Russia, Turkey, and Iran that do decide the fate of Syria. And it looks like, now that Turkey is holding out less, that a political solution finally can be achieved, which is more or less what I was expecting.
Right, and you know, if you put yourself in Erdogan's shoes, right? Like, there's nothing that the U.S. can offer except threats. There's no benefits. The money that is funded to Turkey to take care of roughly 4.5 million refugees right now, Erdogan knows that's going to run out. And what is he going to do when that does happen?
Well, I mean,
Who's going to pay for them, right?
I mean,
So
speaking
he's
of
looking for a
refugees,
solution, but he'd be just as happy for them to go to Europe. There's a time frame, of course, because we don't know for sure exactly what's going to happen if and when things get really, really bad in Europe. I think we're going to have a much clearer picture in about 4 weeks. And then we can speculate a lot better then than now. But I think that's, he's right now, I think, trying to hedge his bets both ways, get a solution in Syria because he knows the money's going to run out. Um, if that doesn't happen, he will have to release them because he has to, you know, believe that he will not be able to take care of these people. And ultimately, the U.S. tried to coup him 6 years ago and failed. And there's no benefits. There's no benefits. He did his part, to whatever small degree, for American foreign policy in the Middle East, and he's not going to want sectarian violence erupting in Turkey, spilling over from Syria, right?
and that's on
Uh,
top of the Kurdish question as it stands.
yes, exactly, exactly. He doesn't want like a third element of sectarian violence to ensue when he's unable to feed these people, right? But there's a window, you know when is this going to happen? And I suspect Europe is going to be divided. You're going to have the left, who know they need immigrants to keep down the nationalist and the right, but they are running out of money. So uh, big decisions are going to have to be made in Europe, decisions that are where ideology meets the road, and it's going to be gruesome. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens next.
Well, speaking of refugee resettlement, there also is. I'd missed the story last week, but there is news out of Lebanon that the president of Lebanon, Mikhail Aoun, has announced that he is beginning the process of resettling refugees back into Syria. In which case, you've
Mm.
seen small scale of that out of Turkey, which I would imagine would probably be for everyone involved, whether that be the Syrians themselves, the Syrian government, that this would be the preferable solution to finally see the resettlement of these people. But once again, now Erdogan does have that two pronged leverage with the energy and with the migrants. And as you said, it will break down a lot along a left right divide. And we could see a return to where it breaks down along a Germany France divide, because you'll recall
Hmm.
all the way back in 2020, 2019, that there was a great deal of tension within NATO and the European Union over its position on Turkey, and this was particularly in reference to the Libya conflict, to the point where France, Macron, was siding with Russia over Germany and a lot of other European Union states, given the situation in Libya. And then you saw this again, given the situation with the migrant caravan that was approaching the Greek Turkish border and the Bulgarian Turkish border, where he actually sent French ships into the Aegean to deter this.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I know the situation has changed drastically upon the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, but and so you likely won't get that French-Russian cooperation. But point being is, Turkey at this point, and I don't know, maybe now that Merkel is out of office, hell, maybe Merkel is the real Eurasianist, pro-Turkish, pro-Russian. But I'm I'm sorry. But point being is, I don't know exactly what Schaz's stance is towards Turkey, but generally Germany has had a pro-Turkish foreign policy for about the past 20, 30 years when it comes to their ascension to the European Union, when it comes to especially the recent crises. It's always been Germany and Turkey have been on the same side in NATO, in European politics, with especially more recently France being the dissenting party. And even under Macron, who's supposed to be this great centrist liberal, so you could see a breakdown not only along ideological lines within Europe, but also along national lines in Europe, which at this point, again, it combines probably what I've speculated the most of what could be the real break in unity in Europe, which is a a scenario between Greece and Turkey that flares out of control, or a split between France and Germany, in which case you could get both, one being caused by the other.
Yes. Yeah, there's not much more I can add to that. The only thing I would say is, what is America's game going to be, right? Because America wants the status quo to continue. Uh, so they don't, because of course, reintegration of these people who fled Syria during the height of the war, right? Um, th- that's possible if America just stops stealing wheat and oil from Syria, right? They don't want a resolution. Like,
Yeah,
they are absolutely fixated on this, right? So there's no solution, but some kind of a solution will have to come about. Um, you know, the only other thing I can think of with the U.S. is now there are talks to have like a consolidated region of Mexico, Canada, and America. Now this was big news, way back in 99, 2000, 2001. I remember talk about this and it disappeared. But Blinken has been in talks with what's his name, Obradero, um, about doing this. So is this preparation? Like, will America leave this region once consolidation on the other hemisphere is brought about? Will that make it happy? You know, it's a possibility. Um, I think America, to some degree, has consigned itself, consoled itself that the world won't be held in America's grip as tightly as it has been. Why else would it do this, right? Like, you could look at it and say, well, see how strong it is. It's doing this, but it's not really America's style because if it does form this union, there's going to be far more input and far more political control from Mexico in American domestic politics.
yeah. I mean, Canada isn't necessarily the problem because I mean,
Yeah,
aside from some feuds with like red state Americans, uh, what is it? Ottawa and DC are more or less in lockstep, even under
yeah,
quote
yeah,
unquote Republican administrations. But
oh yeah.
yeah, especially when it comes to a lot of it. I mean, like yeah, Mexico's really the one that you'd have to be concerned about in that regard. So I also do, since we're on the topic of U.S. news, before we get too far in the Middle East, I do have a piece of American news, and probably next week you can expect my midterm prediction maps. I'll try to get those out by next week on the show. And with that being said, the price of oil it's taken a bit of a plummet because yet another 14 million barrels has been released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve by the Biden administration, and this is clearly to keep energy prices at bay until the midterms, until they can just go ahead and pull the cord on that until the 2024 election cycle, because we've been depleting our strategic reserves as a result of this crisis. You recall when gas prices and energy prices went down during the summer after a certain point where they were starting to reach like $5 a gallon nationally, they opened up the reserve. Which I mean, the reserve is for that kind of situation, but at the same time, we're not producing anymore, and we don't really have anything to supplement this. Nor are we really importing oil, and in fact, we're actually kneecapping ourselves in terms of importing oil and energy. So you have that. Like I said, you can expect gas prices and energy prices to go through the roof after November 8th. I mean, they'll probably look. I'll put it this way: they'll probably give it a bit of breathing period. Probably after Thanksgiving, they'll go ahead and pull the cord on that. You know, they'll give you a few weeks. Now, okay, I should clarify. If the Democrats hold their majority or win even more, they'll pull the plug after Thanksgiving. If the Republicans do it. If the Republicans pull it off, then they'll go ahead and jack up the energy prices almost immediately. That's my official prediction for the
Hmm.
energy prices in
Hmm.
the U.S.
Yeah, I would agree.
And just finally, with some Middle Eastern news that we had already touched on, is that Saudi Arabia and Iran, upon Saudi Arabia snubbing the U.S., the Iranians have proposed negotiations between the two, further negotiations between the two, and the reopening of embassies. And the final piece of Middle Eastern news I have is that tensions do continue between Iran and Azerbaijan, where the IRGC is moving more armor into Armenia in anticipation of a larger conflict. And that was on top of a statement where IRGC officials saying the enemies of the Islamic Republic find refuge in Azerbaijan. So that crisis has been far from put to rest. But there was an interesting Bloomberg headline that I think is really proper to show it just because how absurd it is. Well, actually, how absurd the idea is, but the Bloomberg headline actually is it has a kernel of truth in it, and that is the U.S. will be defeated in a simultaneous fight with Russia, Iran, and China. In which case, I've been saying that the trifecta. If America has to deal with a crisis from all three at the same time, it will not be able to handle. In which case, we either get nuclear Armageddon or we get a complete humbling of the American empire. And I'm not going to make a prediction on either because I could see this administration going either way. When it might just up the belligerence so much because it is in such a losing situation that maybe we don't see the end of days from nuclear hellfire, but we do see a very, very brutal and bloody situation for the American empire if it does try to take on all three of these situations at once. If there is a flare up with the China Taiwan situation, and if there is a flare up given any of the ongoing low burn conflicts in the Middle East, which again at this point I think is rather of when rather than if you get all three of those things happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And the real question is how will the American empire respond? Who will be in office? Will it be Biden? Will it be some Democratic successor? Will Trump be back in there? Will it be maybe like a DeSantis or some other Republican that they groomed for this and put in there? In which case, again, that's probably the. I mean, of course, American foreign policy will have a general trajectory. There will be that quote unquote deep state that does keep it on track. But when it comes to the particular response that it's worlds apart depending on who is actually going to be making that final call.
Yeah, another front somewhere, I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why America had to get out of Afghanistan is because it was just too expensive. And it had to concentrate its economic reserves into Ukraine. Um, of course, its presence in Iraq is greatly dwindled, right? That green zone gets rocket attacks almost once a month now. Um, they're more involved in Syria, so I'm guessing Syria, because of Russia, for them is more important. But as you mentioned, if something happens in Taiwan, I mean, in many ways, just countries resisting America, even Turkey wanting things to get better in Syria, to offload, the refugees, for example. Um, these are all areas where America would have to spend a lot more money, right? It would have to divide its attention and spend more money in order to get what it wants. Um, So it can't really do that. I don't think so. Not right now. And it's going to get that window time frame is going to get smaller. Um, in you know in my estimation.
Yeah, and I couldn't tell you how small that window is, but I would agree with you. And it's one of those situations because it has not played out yet. You can't really say much about it, but I think the point is very solid that the U.S. will be defeated if it has to take on all three simultaneously, and
Hmm.
that gets back to the point that
That's where they're
um,
digging in,
oh
right?
yeah,
Like the way they look at it is, the media can say what it wants about Russia's losing in Ukraine, blah blah blah, right? But their actions don't reflect Russia losing in Ukraine.
no, I mean, like I said, they can point to lackluster performance. They can point to a lot of these things, but as you said, it points to they're bracing for the worst outcome in Ukraine. And just the last piece of Middle Eastern news I'll leave you with is President Raisi of Iran has accused Joe Biden of inciting chaos and terror in Iran. And I mean, it's more or less the case. Really, anyone can see that from even people who support it can see that. And as you had mentioned at the beginning of the show, earlier in the show, that they're trying to peel off Iran, that they're trying to take
Yes,
out the weakest link before they know they have to confront Russia and China in any real way. Because, as that Bloomberg headline said, taking on all three at the same time is simply an impossibility. It is a certain defeat. I know war games aren't necessarily the most reliable because a lot of you have an incentive to lose to increase funding for various programs or whatever vanity project whatever general wants. But point being is we have war games examples with all three countries in which we lose handily to all three, and in which case American military power has only deteriorated since then when it comes to when these were conducted, 2003 and 2018 respectively.
they would have to make a draft.
Oh,
It's that simple.
and
That
this
they're
returns to
too
one.
low.
Oh yeah, yeah. This returns to one of my favorite points when it comes to talking about this stuff. Any conscription within the United States is the end of the American polity. It's over at that point. There
Yeah,
is no legitimacy left to call up an army. I mean, just think about it this way: 1960s America. Of course, you had the social upheaval and a spike in crime, whatever. But point being is, in 1964, on the outbreak of the Vietnam War, at least for the United States. It was really the sunset of that golden age when that post-war prosperity and when you could support a house on one income and you were almost guaranteed a job in whatever the local town's industry was, and you could live a comfortable life just being a blue collar guy. And you had a stable family structure. Yeah, blah blah blah. You can get into some of the social problems of the 1950s, whatever. But point being is, just talking from a point of material prosperity, it is the most materialist 1945 to 1965 America is the most materially prosperous society that has ever existed.
mm,
And even then, when they tried to call up an army into a draft, look at what happened. Look at
mm,
what you got. And again, even if you want to consider an imperial project, which I would consider Vietnam an imperial project, they had a hard time convincing young men to go fight for an America where they could get all those things. Now think about the United States of America in 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, the 2020s, saying to the young American men, let's just take the current draft age, and I imagine they would vastly increase if they needed to. Your young men 18 to 26, which are the first wave of draftees. We're going to need you to fight in this apocalyptic war. And if they told young men that in 1965 and you had the kind of backlash, imagine what the backlash is going to be in 2025. It's going to be, like I said, there's not many things I think that can bring about the rapid end of the American polity, but I think trying to reintroduce conscription in any degree, even a peacetime conscription, is the end of the American polity.
yeah, yeah. Especially now, it's much more diverse. Like Mexican Americans don't give a shit about Ukraine or Syria, Iran, or Taiwan, or China. They don't care. Like Their concerns, uh, like Black Americans, are extremely domestic, extremely domestic. They do not have a concept of America globally. They have a concept of America and what it can do for them domestically.
Yeah, and any of them
They,
who do
they're
have
not
that
invested
concept.
they're not invested in global America in any significant way, uh, because they're not invested in its history.
Oh no, and any of the ones who do have a more global mindset are third worldists. They
Yeah,
sympathize with, for example, the regime in South Africa or Venezuela or wherever, or you'll get a few interesting ones where like they might be like pro Assad or something, or maybe even
yeah,
marginally pro Russia. But point being is they're third worldists through and through if they have any consciousness of America on a global
good
scale.
point. Hmm.
So it's either complete ignorance and detachment from it, or complete opposition to it. Both of which you don't. And again, you'd have to make the benefits damn fine if you wanted to increase that. And I mean, you already have a constant stream of people from Latin America, from places like Colombia and Central America, who who become more or less mercenaries for the American Empire in hopes of getting citizenship or at least residency here. So I mean, what are you gonna do? More of that? Recruit more Colombian mercenaries to go fight our wars in Iran or Taiwan or Ukraine? I mean, yeah, okay, that works to a certain extent. You can deploy the foreign auxiliaries. You can make them all these great promises. But in terms of being able to get the manpower that you would need not just a draft. You'd need a general mobilization of the American population. Pretty much, any man who can hold a rifle can, and anyone man who can walk and hold a rifle would be eligible for military service, and they would throw you into the meat grinder. In which case, like I said, there's a reason I describe it as an apocalyptic war because number one, that's what you'd need for the American Empire to even attempt to do that. In which case, I would say at least they see the situation as apocalyptic. They could see the situation as apocalyptic in a few years. But again, that I think they realize, even on a subconscious level, that general mobilization, if such a concept can even exist in America, something even beyond selective service, and I would say even just like the selective service draft lottery, completely politically unviable. And like I said, if anything can collapse the American state, it's that.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Think also how diverse America is right now compared to mid late 60s. It's a world of a difference, right? I mean, 23 to 24% reduction in people joining the military.
And then also look at the demographics of military age men, once again, that 18 to 26, whereas the general demographics may show like a 60% majority on Americans' part. I'm like once you get to men who are 18 to 26, what do you think those numbers look like?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly, right. So it's not there. I completely agree with you. They would like that would probably be more likely to trigger a civil war than than horrible rhetoric and uh, diversity hires and more white demonization in media. That would do it. That
Now,
would do it.
once again, combine that with sort of the imagine if places like Brazil, Argentina, and like China or wherever also were, let's just say, more accommodating to white professionals, like we were discussing somewhat towards the beginning of the show. I mean, just imagine combining those two things in any
Hmm.
country like that wouldn't take advantage of a crisis like that. It would be
Oh.
one of the most foolish things they could ever do. And I mean, hell, maybe given the situation in Europe, you could see some of these South American countries try to scrape off European professionals too.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, we're in a geopolitical crunch time right now. It's really begun.
I mean, I've been saying this since the outbreak of the war, and even I sort of alluded to this even before the war broke out, and said like, if a war breaks out or if something like that happens, we have the potential to see 2022 be the most monumental year in history since I would say 1914.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's funny, this war started just as COVID inflation kicked in. Not good. The countries that did a lot of lockdowns, that spent a hell of a lot of money, it's biting them back. Um, Countries that didn't do spend a lot of money on lockdowns, well, less inflation. Things are better off for them. There are exceptions. I know there's all kinds of naysayers, and they have their points here and there, but generally speaking, China is still fine. And 2021 was actually, a much better year for them than anybody else.
Yeah, and
So
Russia's economy seems to be going the exact opposite direction than they had hoped for, and in fact actually tried to work towards. So
yeah.
there's that as well. And once again, it's more or less the American empire inflating itself out of inflation while also scraping what it can from Europe for the short term. And like I said, that'll buy us a few years, but once that wealth that we garnered from these pirate tactics, I'll call it, wears off, what's it going to look like then?
hmm hmm Yeah, I mean, they're going to use basically America will, if they escalate the war in Ukraine, if they are committed that there cannot be a Russian victory, um, if they are absolutely committed to that, then um, they Poland eventually has to join the war, right? They're the most willing, and my argument is again, um, not having a quick victory for Russia has worked out in its favor because the longer this drags on, the less likely that they will want to. If there was a quick victory, and let's say a portion of Ukraine was still, hostile, and a year or two later, um, things began to bubble up again, it would just be like Minsk 3. That's all that would have happened. You know, they, arming Ukraine would happen again. There'd have to be new threats, but Ukraine would have set up more defenses, and reinvading would have been harder, and so on and so on. I'm firmly convinced of that now. Now that we've had the luxury of 8 months of this war, that's what I see. And a really tough winter economically. I think we're going to see support for Ukraine peel off. In fact, you could argue in the US that one of the best preemptions, one of the best off ramps for Ukraine is a Republican victory. And it, it would it would tear America apart, but it would be the kind of nonsense that we saw during the Floyd riots. It would not it would not lead to a civil war the way conscription would, right? Maybe some are considering that's a better option because then the war can be blamed on Biden. So everything was an exaggeration. Jens Stoltenberg is going to be replaced anyways, right? Um, who knows? Who knows? Um, might be difficult if Boris Johnson is elected. Apparently he's acquired 37 seats of the 100 needed to get the leadership or try to get the leadership, and he's offering a fig leaf to Sunak. That would make it difficult, but I think we'll have to see how the primaries go. Because generally speaking, right now the Republican Party represents the working class better than the Democrats do. The Democrats is basically a collection of magic Americans and various political class groups that have certain political privileges and so on. Um, that whole equity game that's being played. So that could be an off ramp.
Yeah, I would agree, and that's probably the only off ramp. So I guess especially when it comes to the American response to this, a lot of this will just have to be bookmarked until November, and let's see,
Hmm.
yeah, November 8th is election day, and then Congress, the new session would start in January 23, so we'd see that happen. But
They're
yeah,
just like 2 weeks away.
yeah, yeah, it's just like, let's see, that is, yeah, about 2.5 weeks. So
Hmm.
yeah, November 8th, about 2.5 weeks away. But with that, that's all I had for this episode. Unless you had any last minute stories.
No, that's it for me.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of War Report. Thank you everyone for the very few subscriptions I've gotten. Once again, just a reminder that I'm not going to charge for those. I may write at some point in the future, but at this point, that's not going to happen. And of course, we also do have the BitChute channel, in which case, once I get the Substack MP3 files working, I'll get those uploaded, and the BitChute I can just upload the video file directly. And those always will be the early premiere, so if you want to see the episode before it comes out on YouTube, you can head over there. And not to mention the unstable situation on YouTube may mean this platform isn't always a guarantee, so you can
Hmm.
always find us other places, don't worry. I'm going to do this show as long as humanly possible, so thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode once again, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.